If you're looking to become a master of Odinsphere's combat, this is the place to start. We need to talk about combat in general, air juggling, character-specific skill details, and a note regarding skill link, which should be on display and in the description for you to skip as needed. Odinsphere's difficulty levels will tell you what you need to know about how much you should know about the game to succeed. And while it's not super deep, different difficulty settings have a couple more modifiers beyond just adjusting damage percentages. For instance, dwarf enemies drop a bomb when they die on easy, but drop 3 on hard. Elven warriors and paladins will swing their swords normally on lower difficulties, but create little aerial shockwaves that travel a short distance on harder settings. And for the last 2.5 years, I didn't even know that the blue-robed mages could block until I recently played the game on easy. Difficulty also affects how fast some projectile attacks fly, like a barbarian's hammer or a female geist's blue flame. On easy and normal, enemies can be momentarily staggered more frequently, and the act of absorbing phosons actually heals a little bit of health. Whereas on hard and heroic, enemies don't get staggered as often and phoson healing is no longer present. POW appears to recover more slowly on higher difficulties as well. And of course, heroic prevents your character's health from increasing in almost every conceivable way. On heroic, the only thing that can give you more HP is Mori's Bell. That's it, and that'll only buy you around 100 HP. The sums from things like Sun Pendants would have been even more paltry, but you'll get nothing at all from them. None from gourmet food, not even from miracle fruits. Needless to say, foreknowledge will serve you very well. In terms of what to expect, easy lets you breeze through most of the game without really having to consider levels, touch potions, or level grind in the slightest. Normal makes things challenging enough that you'll pay attention to the intricacies of combat, utilize potions when necessary, and seek out your desired means of gaining XP, be that through combat or acquiring ingredients / funds for food. Hard will punish you more for your mistakes, demand that you level up often in order to keep pace with bosses, and can even best you even if you know what to expect. Heroic appears to be basically the same as hard, but with the HP caveat added to complicate things, making the use of certain potions practically necessary to succeed. When talking about Odinsphere's combat, the most important thing to do is to cover the distinction between the third character Mercedes in relation to the others. Air juggling is a fun and effective way to dispatch your enemies, and while Mercedes can keep an enemy aloft for a time, there is nowhere near as much precision or finesse to the process. So when talking about air juggling combat strategies, don't factor her into the discussion because she's not really part of it. The focus of Mercedes is on the utilization of Psypher point skills, which is clear not just from the fact that she has the fewest POW skills of any other character, but because of her unique ability that bears repeating because of how important it is. Mercedes can recover some Psypher points upon landing a critical hit on enemies. This is extremely important to keep in mind, because not only are Mercedes' critical hits indistinguishable from normal shots, the game in no way informs the player that she's capable of recovering some Psypher points on her own through critical hits. And on top of that, this won't even happen until after Mercedes acquires a Psypher skill. Also bear in mind the following. One of the things luck does is increase the likelihood of scoring a critical hit. Although Luck Stone Zeros do not provide a luck boost, plus 1 and 2 versions do. The same goes for amulets, but Frog's status protection is not as good. You can increase that stat boost even further with the reinforcement ability, which enhances the secondary effects of equipment. Note, if you have this ability, go into the equipment screen and look at the stats. You won't see any difference beyond what's available by default. This is because the equipment screen is meant to show the base stats, much in the same way that looking at food descriptions shows you the base XP values even if you have the gourmet ability. Simply exit the equipment screen and contrast what was shown there with your stats on display now, and you should see the difference with the effect applied. However, Mercedes can never actually acquire luck stones or amulets that boost luck for free, or even from merchants. So the only way to take advantage of those items is to transfer them from another character after completing Velvet's story. At their core, each character shares very similar attributes with the exception of Mercedes. As a refresher, up square is a rising attack. Each character can use theirs once from the ground and once again while in the air, but still only one time in the air if they jump or use a different attack to get into the air. Oswald is a little different in that he slashes upward first, then kicks to gain height. You can either slash upwards, wait, jump, or use another attack and then kick, or just hold down square to kick immediately after slashing. These are what you'll use to air juggle in the early stages when you lack launching POW attacks. Down square is the slide attack that can be charged to achieve different effects, but you'll use the quick version to break through an enemy's block more often than not. The only one that's particularly noteworthy is Oswald's, as charging up his attacks turns into a lunging strike where you can mash the square button to regain Berserk charge. As a note, you can also charge down square attacks in mid-air rather than waiting for them to touch down first. Holding square and left or right executes a dash attack that can be used up to 3 times in mid-air. Cornelius is the only one with distinct mid-air and ground versions, with the former being the one that's most useful, as while the ground attack can keep some downed enemies aloft, it only works if there aren't any other enemies that can get in your way. Plus, it doesn't do a ton of damage anyway. Gliding doesn't factor into combat for most characters, but there are a couple of exceptions. Oswald's glide keeps him safe from harm by making him impossible to hit. The interesting thing is that not even poison or fire damage will occur while he's intangible. Velvet can't avoid poison or fire damage, but she's just as untouchable when swinging from her chain. She can only swing 3 times while holding X, but that should be more than enough to get her out of a particularly chaotic situation. She's also incapable of being knocked down or damaged while using Air Raid, or has an enemy gripped with Sling Whip or Tilt Whip. Blocking may not be as fast and satisfying as dodging, but some characters have abilities that impart special boons for blocking successfully, like increased knockback chance, a shield bash, or parry. But even if you don't invest in said abilities, blocking also contributes points to your overall score at the end of an area. Although, there's only so many times that you can add to the score before it stops counting. Speaking of inflating your score, continuing to hit enemies in the air will add to your hit counter even if they're dead. This is especially useful for combat sequences with multiple waves of enemies that don't arrive in rapid succession, as you can continue to juggle the previous enemies in the air while you wait, then continue the chain of hits on the newcomers. As a note, the hit counter caps at 999, and you can't get the hit counter bonuses multiple times. If you're wondering what overkills are that can be sometimes seen among other score-oriented info, those are the critical hits that happen when the game pauses during a basic attack combo for a second. Your character says a line, and you get a giant boost of damage for the final attack, or series attacks when using Velvet's mid-air combo. Speaking of overkills, you can redirect the overkill attack's direction, as well as the direction of the final attack of certain Psypher skills like Oswald's Vile Rush from left to right and vice versa. You can also change the direction of any Psypher skill that's executed when pausing with L1. So if you pause and notice an enemy has gotten in range behind you, you can activate a skill, then hold the appropriate direction before the gameplay resumes, which will fire off the skill as though you were facing that direction the whole time. Some general tips against enemies. The bombs buried by dwarves can be dug up by attacking them. These, as well as those tossed at you, will have a bit of a red glowing aura around them. Hit these bombs a single time, whereupon they'll turn blue and will not harm you, but injure your enemies instead. Elemental attacks to concern yourself with are limited mostly to fire, ice, and poison. The reason being that it appears as though enemies may take about 50% less or more damage depending on their characteristics and the attacks used, i.e. enemies that are resistant to freezing might take less damage from ice attacks, and enemies resistant to poison might take less damage from poison attacks, etc. However, I don't think that this applies to the element-infused POW skills, only elemental potions and cipher point skills. But there are just too many skills, potions, and enemies to test out, so I'll just leave off with this. Ice will extinguish fires, and fires will thaw frozen enemies, so be mindful of what you plan on hitting your foes with. Fairies, or as the game calls them, elves that just happen to have fairy wings apparently, act as support units, and anyone that isn't an archer is a threat that should be dealt with first and foremost so that they don't distract you, especially during boss fights, because healers in particular will make things way more difficult if you don't deal with them. Those little molten rock guys that look like a cross between Geodude from Pokemon and a jack-o'-lantern? Yeah, they explode when they die, so for the love of Freya, don't invade their personal space after their health runs out. Not only can many projectiles be blocked, but many thrown weapons can be attacked to send them back to whoever or whatever threw them. For instance, goblin and red cap knives can be knocked back to potentially poison them or any other enemy that gets in the path. And swords summoned by wizards can be launched back to stun them. You can block to make fire and ice elementals die on contact, but this isn't very consistent in my experience, at least with regards to the larger versions of them. Killing generals, those gold armored enemies in Titania, will sometimes cause all the steel armors and steel armor leaders in an area to instantly drop dead. I think that you might also need to dispatch any mages or wizards or whatever in the area. Not 100% sure what exactly triggers that. Ghost enemies in the Netherworld can be attacked in one of 3 ways. The first and most practical is to simply fight them near one of the candle-holding cursed denizens to illuminate them. The second and easiest is to just use a shine potion to create your own little zone of light in which to fight enemies. And the final one that I always fall back on when the first isn't an option is being in the right place for their attacks. Ghost enemies temporarily become corporeal when they start executing an attack. The little animal skeletons will have different requirements. Dogs just need you to be close and in front of them, fish need you to be on the same vertical plane, and birds need you to be at like a 45-degree angle downward and in front of them so they can try to dive bomb you. Female geists, on the other hand, are different. They use a blue flame projectile attack that you can launch back at them with your own attack to make them corporeal. Blocking won't reflect them. You can also just walk right up to them, block beforehand to protect against the flurry of attacks that will ensue, as well as buff your score a little bit, then lay into them. Lastly, don't neglect Psypher point skills, especially during the mid and region boss fights. Even against common enemies, there are plenty of skills that cost very little to execute, and you can fill the meter back up pretty damn fast. Naturally, this goes double for Mercedes and anyone playing on extra new game. Juggling enemies is first done by executing an attack that will knock an enemy down, then launching them into the air. Standard cannon fodder enemies on normal difficulty can get knocked back by your default multi-hit combo and usually launched into the air at will. But some enemies, like those that might only get staggered a bit by your combo, like the Valkyrie leaders, Elven paladins and the like, are more hardy, and are best handled with POW attacks with a high knockdown chance. However, it's still possible to launch them with regular attacks from time to time, and using the character's slide attack to break their guard is always a great way to get an opening as well. Gwendolyn's Beak Drive and later Rising Crescent, Cornelius' Arc Wheel, Oswald's Fatal Raid, and Velvet's Dancing Chain, and lastly Crossbind, fit this role best. The basic rule of air juggling most of the time is, the higher you can get, the better. This is because if you're not far from ground level and there are enemies around, they can knock you out of the sky and out of your combo. This is particularly infuriating when you're talking about tall mid-bosses like Unicorn Knights that can keep you from juggling an enemy because your character's toes clipped its forehead or something and stopped you from moving forward. It's also possible for uneven terrain to screw you over by having peaks where you aren't expecting them, particularly in certain snow and fairy forest areas. That said, it's also possible to hit the ceiling of the combat area and have some attacks fail to connect when they normally would have had there been more room. So there's some experimentation that's necessary to know what can be used at what height. As for what to do when the enemy is in the air, I'll cover that when talking about the characters specifically, because each one needs a slightly different approach. But in essence, you'll be switching between POW attacks and normal attacks. The thing to keep in mind with each character is that they may have different moves, but there's something all of them need to consider, especially on hard and heroic, and that's the Phozons themselves. This is because using a POW or Psypher point attack interrupts the process of Phozons being automatically drawn to your Psypher. So since absorbing a single Phozon jumpstarts the POW recovery process, and bosses release some Phozons once their first health bar is depleted, it's best to empty your POW gauge as soon as possible and then use normal attacks to let Phozons come to you and let the POW gauge recover. This is especially important on the harder difficulty settings because the POW gauge does not recover nearly as quickly as it does on something like easy. Don't worry about Phozons disappearing though, because as long as you're not fighting a boss with a Psypher weapon that can absorb Phozons, they will all stay all the way through to the end of the match. Even if you don't see them, trust me, they are most certainly there. While it's no secret that most standard enemies can be hurled into the air, some mid-bosses and even region bosses can be juggled in the air. Try using a launch attack like Rising Crescent a couple times at the beginning of a fight with a mid-boss to get an idea of which ones can be sent skyward. This will almost always work with the second attempt, but will be more difficult to pull off consistently afterwards. For the most consistent results, Just attack until one of the boss's life bars is about to be depleted. Then use whatever launching attacks work best for you, since the boss will be capable of being kept aloft at this point. This is especially important because no matter how good you are or what attacks you have access to, standard enemies and bosses alike can only be juggled in the air for so long before they start falling, no matter what you do. When air juggling as Gwendolyn, Needle Strike will boost the hit counter, the number of skill activations for skill link, and can be used multiple times in a row without knocking enemies out of range of the next Needle Strike. She can use her rising attack immediately after Needle Strike, but not her basic attacks. To continue the combo with an enemy that would normally be knocked out of range, use a mid-air dash attack. This will push Gwendolyn past the enemies, so you'll have to turn around so that you can attack, but you'll be close enough to hit them with either a basic combo or Needle Strike. If you need a little extra lift to keep yourself out of range of enemies, Gwendolyn's high thrust pow attack can give you a little bit of a boost if the enemies are in range. Just know that it's not always easy to get enemies drawn into the attack effectively. Cornelius is the worst character to air juggle as, save for Mercedes, and is easily the least fun to play as on hard extra new game. Getting an enemy into the air isn't that difficult for the first run through, but there are still several things to take into account by default. The first is his Spiral Claw attack, which acts as Cornelius's mid-air multi-hit pow attack. It doesn't knock away enemies at all, so it's possible to chain several attacks in a row without using a single dash attack. The problem is that it's most effective when aimed 45 degrees upwards, which can not only cause problems with mid-stage bosses like Vulcans, which won't be hit by your second basic attack in a combo if they and you are at the battle stage's ceiling, but you can't use your entire basic combo on any enemy, even if some of them can be hit by all of the attacks, because the final hit will knock them way beyond any hope of retrieval. You can use your basic combo if they and you are not too far above the ground, but the safest method is to hit the enemy with basic attacks 3 times instead of 4. Use mid-air dash attacks and repeat. Just keep in mind that Cornelius' dash attack is different from all of the others, in that it's continuous for as long as you hold the square button down. And while you can technically use the attack 3 times, that's dependent on how long you keep attacking for. Since the goal is to use as many infinitely repeatable attacks as possible, you need to hold square long enough for the attack to be started and then start slashing with basic attacks as soon as it starts hitting so that you can use it 3 times. If you want to try incorporating Cornelius' down X attack into your repertoire, I won't stop you, but in my experience, it was so useless that I kept forgetting about it even existing and had to be reminded by the tutorials multiple times. Oswald brings the pain, but some enemies can require different strategies. See, like Cornelius' basic combo, the final hit of Vile Rush knocks enemies back violently. Unlike Cornelius' attack, however, enemies bounce off of the edge of the screen so that you can catch them with your attacks. The twist is that while most enemies can be caught with your dash attack, others can't and will be left behind instead. These include, but may not be limited to, Evil Eyes, Wizard Bosses, Vulcans, Phoenix Riders, and likely playable character bosses. In these instances, rather than trying to rush to hit them with a dash attack, let them bounce off of the wall and come to you instead. Just keep in mind that depending on the height, said foes may end up either on your left or right, so you need to watch carefully. If you can use a second Vile Rush, however, you can also catch them with that. If you don't like the idea of waiting, most of the other bosses and enemies can be hit with your dash attack immediately after the last Vile Rush hit. But waiting for the bosses to come back to you lets you save those attacks for when it comes times to use the standard combos. Once you get Fatal Raid, it can function just as well, and in most cases better, than Vile Rush, thanks to its high damage and quick execution. Keep that quick execution aspect in mind, because if you'll recall, no enemy, not even basic enemies that have long since been defeated, can be air juggled indefinitely. So doing lots of damage fast is great even if it didn't contribute to the hit counter to a respectable degree. However, depending on the enemy, you may end up hitting and then pushing past them. Don't worry though, you can still turn around and catch them with your attacks pretty easily. Aside from that, just use the basic attack combo followed by a dash attack while waiting for POW to recover. Speaking of the dash attack, like Cornelius, the attack continues for as long as you hold the square button. But unlike Cornelius, you can still use the attack 3 times regardless of how long you hold the button down for. Velvet has to wait a bit longer than even Gwendolyn to get her multi-hit Phozon Prism. But once she finally does get her hand on Spiral Drive, that's what you'll be using to keep the pain train going. Like Cornelius, she can use regular attack combos right after using the POW skill, but unlike Gwendolyn, she can't hit them with the rising attack afterward. Like Gwendolyn, however, Velvet's dash attack puts her past the enemy, so you have to turn around in order to keep smacking your foes. Velvet doesn't get air raid until near the very end of her story, but it's worth keeping in mind in the future that it's one of the cheapest POW skills to use and can light enemies on fire, which will boost the amount of damage your attacks do with the Burn Assailer skill. When it comes to Psypher skills, you may be tempted to put all of your points into the default skill that augments base damage because it's mathematically superior to most of the other options at first. Don't. Not because it makes you too powerful, far from it. You'll use special attacks far more often, and even if leveling them up didn't still provide you with increased attack and Psypher points, it will always improve some aspect of the attack/passive skill, such as increasing knockdown potential, base attack damage, the number of hits, etc. Plus, the final level of all but one of the POW skills reduces the percentage cost of the attack by 5. If you really want to boost the overall damage of attacks, put points into the Assault High, Skill Link, and Beatdown skills. Keep in mind that Psypher skills are going to cost more to upgrade the later in the game that they're acquired, and the more times that they're leveled up. You're going to want every Phozon Prism you can get your hands on, save for one that I'll mention later, because merely acquiring them gives you a boost to your attack and Psypher points, and passive skills will apply their effects even if you don't level them up. As a general rule, charge attacks aren't usually worth the trouble, but should be actively avoided even more so when playing on the heroic difficulty and one hit can spell doom for you. Each skill starts off at level 1 once you first acquire it, and depending on the skill can be leveled up 4 times, 2 times, or not at all. So I'll be displaying all of the skills with their level 2 bonuses that they acquire upon leveling up, as well as each of the augments to the skill from that point onward, assuming that applies. For Gwendolyn, Ice Shot is a decent attack and cheap to upgrade, but it can't freeze your enemies solid and can only chill them for a time. It can be used in mid-air, so throw it in a combo if you want to keep your enemies aloft while you land and regain rising and dash attack uses. Beak Drive is best for parsing past enemies, but the knockdown potential is good, and you can use a rising attack immediately afterwards. High Thrust isn't something you can use at ground level against standard enemies unless they're already in the air, like fairy archers and the like. However, it's good to use against Frostbends and the balloons on Aesir airships. Icicle Wave is the cheapest PowerPoint attack that can freeze enemies. It doesn't have the best range and damage, but it's something you can throw out from time to time to greater effect than Ice Shot. Even when fully leveled up, Comet Spear blows. Rising Crescent is fantastic for launching enemies into the air, as it has a very high knockdown potential. Fall Clash looks badass, but it's not 100% consistent. Though on the plus side, it has the capacity to make enemies that are driven into the ground by the attack bounce and let you catch them with your attacks to continue the pain train if you're using it in a mid-air combo. Speaking of pain, Pain Feather is pretty much useless, as it costs power points to use and does no damage at all, regardless of the enemy that it's used on. Blizzard is pretty good on its own, but a maxed out Blizzard with freeze enhancement and icebreaker is pretty damn fantastic. You can skip the overlong Gungnir animation by pressing start. Needlestorm is a nice and cheap multi-hit attack, but since it's literally the last skill you get, it'll be a long time before you get to experience it for yourself. Gwendolyn's ability that lets her reflect enemy projectiles while blocking is so absurdly fickle that there's no real point in trying to record what it can and can't work on. Just to give you an idea of how ridiculous this is, her shield can't reflect the blue flames launched by female geists that are supposed to be capable of being reflected back to make them corporeal, but it can instantly turn the entire vortex of a cyclone potion right back. For Cornelius, Arc Wheel doesn't knock down enemies easily due to you likely only being able to get like one hit off on smaller standard enemies. Fortunately, you can use the ground-based dash attack afterwards to give yourself the chance to launch them into the air proper with your Spiral Claw attack. Spark Bolt doesn't get stronger till the very end, so it's kind of a hard sell. But it's still a nice and cheap Psypher point attack that can be thrown out from time to time. Whirling Blade is another hard sell, given that it's one of the most costly POW attacks in the game. But once you increase the knockback potential and reduce the POW cost, it gets to be much better. Plasma Circle is a double-edged sword, in that it's great for continuously inflicting damage, but much like the Fire Spirit's potion, it can royally screw you with air juggling attempts. Speaking of the Spirit Potions, you can't have them and Plasma Circle active at the same time. Triggering one while the other is active will overwrite the prior effect, so keep this in mind when tackling Heroic Mode where Ice Spirits are king. I found that Thundercloud is far too weak and ineffective to be used at any time. The knockback potential just isn't that high, you can't increase its duration in the slightest, it doesn't attack as frequently as one would like, it's got a fairly narrow range where it can actually hit enemies, its homing effect isn't that fantastic, so yeah, not something I use. Spiral Fall is terrible when used against multiple enemies, but very effective one-on-one, because enemies will be immobile for as long as they continue to take damage from the attack. It doesn't do a ton of damage, but it does boost your hit counter, and is pretty cheap POW cost-wise. Just know that when used in the air, Cornelius will slam straight down, but if used on the ground, he will leap up, forward a little bit, then dart downwards, ending up slightly to the side as a result. If you miss your attack, dodge to get out of the way because you can't move at all otherwise. Streak Slash is better at hitting your enemies than Arc Wheel, and cheaper to use than Whirling Blade, but still doesn't have that much in the way of knockdown / knockback potential as either of the others, though it's still respectable. Reverse Claw is fantastic for instantly darting behind enemies, and only becomes more lethal with the backstab ability. Couple that with a low POW cost, and this is a pretty damn sweet ability. Tempest can keep enemies trapped in its vortex more effectively than Cyclone Potions, but you'll have to wait a few seconds before the attack is actually executed, which makes you a sitting duck for enemies on heroic difficulty. Speaking of being a sitting duck, good God, Lightning Saber is terrible. It takes even longer to execute. You can be knocked out of the animation and lose the power points for the attack with even the weakest of attacks. And even if you do manage to use the effect, Cornelius becomes so fast that he's difficult to control most of the time. You can't use rising attacks, and to top it all off, the spark bolts loosed from the sword barely do any damage, and don't stun often even with stun enhancement maxed out. One thing that I didn't know until recently is that it completely changes Cornelius' dash attacks, turning both the ground and air attacks into some strange electric point-to-point damage zone that can be chained for as long as the effect lasts for, and can be moved in any direction similarly to Oswald's Berserk charged down square attack. The one and only way you're going to be able to use Lightning Saber without losing power points is if you run to the opposite side of the combat area to the enemies and pray that they don't reach you in time, or use a painkiller potion to keep from being knocked down. For Mercedes, I find Round Shot to be a much better investment than Photon Burst, given the significant range and damage that it offers. Slip Slide is cheap, lets you parse past enemies and bosses, can keep airborne enemies aloft for a time, and thanks to its knockdown potential and spaced out shot impacts, can give you a moment of reprieve wherein you can reload in peace. Pixie Call isn't the worst, but there's a much better alternative. Energy Shot just isn't strong enough to warrant its high POW cost, in my opinion. Mandragora March isn't very useful at all, but it's an amusing novelty if nothing else. As a side note, each Mandragora has their own unique effects. Onyone's stun enemies, Characteers give you health every time they damage an enemy, Cub's Banes poison enemies, Tourney's chill enemies, and Habanaristo's light enemies on fire. So obviously you wouldn't want Tourney's and Habanaristo's attacking at the same time, since one will counter the other's effects. Banshee Call is one of Mercedes' best skills, especially when you increase the fire frequency. From the description, you'd expect it to haphazardly bounce around the battlefield with no rhyme or reason, but it's more like a shot that crawls along the ground like a partially charged down square attack. And like that attack, it parses past enemies, and with the increased knockback potential, can help keep several enemies at bay. Add on the fact that some bosses can be hit multiple times and the ability to have two Banshees out at once, and Mercedes' potential to recover Psypher points through her normal shots as critical hits, and this skill can do some serious damage. Unlimited ammo doesn't last that long, but it still has its uses. It's best used combining a full POW gauge and the full power ability. Like Fire Pillars created by Velvet and Blaze Potions, this Burst Rain attack is only useful if you can keep an enemy/boss in a very specific location. What's more, you can only have one active at any given time, though it can be used in the 2D shooter stages, so there's that. Like Cornelius' Spiral Fall attack, Lunarside's shot stun locks anything that it hits, making it useful for getting behind bosses without worrying about being hit by attacks in the intervening time, though it does cost more to use, so keep that in mind. Rion Axe animation can be skipped by pressing start. Spirit Call, despite costing more to use, isn't as effective as Banshee Call and doesn't last as long either. Speaking of the call skills, you can only use Spirit Call once. You can only have either 2 Banshee Calls, 2 Pixie Calls, or one of each at the same time, but you can only use 1 Spirit Call with any one of those 3 combinations. As for Mercedes' abilities, you may be tempted to get faster reload, but the time decrease is barely noticeable, assuming you even do manage to notice it. So do not expect a game-changing ability that gives you a big advantage. Crazed Grip is great for getting behind bosses and doing damage fast, though you have to be mindful of its high POW cost. Shadow Bite is really weak, but knocked down enemies can be carried into the air with it, making it useful if you accidentally knocked down an enemy with the Vile Rush attack and pause by going into the skill activation menu before the enemy could hit the ground. Fatal Raid is, as the name implies, fatal to a lot of standard enemies, and does its damage much faster than Vile Rush, making it a strong contender to replace Vile Rush when fully upgraded. It's also got great knockdown potential, even though it can't be boosted through leveling up the skill. Aerial Dive is shockingly powerful, costs less to use than Crazed Grip, and also parses past enemies, making it a much more effective alternative for getting behind bosses and enemies. Most black fire attacks aren't worth your time, except for Nightmare Blast. Nightmare Blast starts by launching in a straight line forward, then in a straight line back. But after that, it will constantly circle around and home in on nearby enemies. The trick is to make sure that you don't move too far and erratically, because it will follow you in an attempt to protect you from enemies. Therefore, it's best used in chaotic flustercuck situations with enemies all over the place, like the King Ooze fight. Phantom Killer is a really badass attack that can do impressive damage, especially when you get the backstab ability, and can even react to projectile attacks. For instance, a snowball rolled downhill by an ice troll can trigger the Phantom Killer attack and teleport you all the way to the troll, seemingly no matter how far away you are. However, in order for the attack to work, Oswald must be facing the attack that's being executed, or else it will fail, so keep that in mind. Predictably, Exclusion's invincibility doesn't last long, and while it's a decent length of time, A, it won't stop you from being knocked around by enemies, and B, it won't stop damage from status effects. Eclipse, like Spiral Fall and Lunarcide Shot, stun locks enemies hit with it, and it's a much better way to get Berserk energy, especially during boss fights. You also can't have more than one area of effect active at the same time, so don't spam it incessantly. Although it doesn't do much damage, being able to get health and a ton of Berserk charge recovered is a very valuable tool. As Oswald, the Berserk mode is obviously a valuable tool that should not be neglected, especially since you regain the ability to use it pretty damn fast. But even faster if you take advantage of his charged down square attack. Try to remember to use this attack when there's only one enemy left in the fight to bolster your reserves for the next fight. Also worth noting is that you can use Oswald's charged Berserk draining attack against bosses that are capable of being juggled. As long as the boss has been knocked back to the point where it would be considered knocked down, you can charge up a down square attack, keeping in mind that this can be done in the air, then hit the boss with it and actually drain Berserk energy from them. You don't need to continue holding anything after executing a down square dash attack as Oswald in Berserk mode, and in fact you can use the D-pad/analog stick to steer the attack around if you want. Whether it be through normal means or using the Madness Psypher skill, Oswald's Berserk mode won't actually end when you run out of power until you touch the ground. So take advantage of this by staying aloft for as long as possible while engaging enemies. Get Oswald's Shadow Step ability last, because all it does is let you change directions while gliding. For Velvet, Dancing Chain can be very powerful, but you have to be extremely wary when using it on heroic difficulty. Because if an enemy spawns behind you, or your attack stretches further than you intended, you'll be completely helpless to any attacks that will come your way. Sling Whip is effective and amusing as all hell, but it has its problems. For one, I cannot nail down the timing required to make it slam back and forth for the life of me, so I have no choice but to spam left and right constantly to make it work. The other problem is that enemies can bounce, letting you air juggle them, but as for what triggers this, I haven't the faintest idea. Fortunately, however, you can't be hit by attacks while you have an enemy gripped, and slamming an enemy into the ground near another enemy will damage it. On top of this, like Oswald's Berserk draining attack, both Sling Whip and Tilt Whip can be used against bosses that are capable of being air juggled so long as they've been knocked down first. One last little thing to keep in mind is that if you trigger the attack with, say, a D-pad only command, you have to spam left and right with the D-pad. You can't use the analog sticks, and vice versa. Burning Curse is something that I never really found a use for personally, but if you want to try it out for yourself, the best bet will be to use it when there's a good crowd of enemies to affect. Twin Tornado is also useless in my experience. The projectiles don't do that much damage, they can't seem to knock enemies down that significantly, they can't hit enemies multiple times, the range is nowhere near as significant, and it's just all around a lot less impressive than the version used by the boss version of Velvet. Round Flare, on the other hand, is great for setting enemies on fire without spending power points, especially if you've got the Burn Assailer skill. Just keep in mind that if you want to set enemies on fire consistently, you'll need the Burn Enhancement skill to be fortified as well. Round Flare is also capable of reaching the weak spots of Frost Bends from ground level and hitting both balloons on an Aesir airship. Drop Shell is the only Psypher skill that I actively avoid and would call a detriment, to the point where even Mandragora March is better by virtue of the fact that putting points into it at least boosts your stats even if you don't use it at all. Drop Shell, meanwhile, is a passive skill that is activated by pressing down while dodging. This wouldn't be a problem were it not for the fact that it consumes POW every time you use it, whether you intended to or not. You can't turn the skill off. It costs an absurd 15% to activate, and just to add insult to injury, doesn't even reduce the cost when upgrading it like literally every single other POW skill in the damn game. It's found on the far right of the Titania map, and I highly recommend saving the game before getting it so that you can judge how easy or difficult it is to either intentionally or accidentally trigger the attack. The good news is that if you're like me and want to avoid it like the plague, you don't have to get it. The bad news is that in order to circumvent the path and continue the story, you'll have to best the King Ooze trial stage, which is challenging on hard and can be a damn nightmare on heroic. Air Raid is great for getting past enemies, while also burning them in the process. Not only is Velvet incapable of being hit, the attack also stun locks enemies hit by it too. Crossbind, however, is so ridiculously useful to the point where it feels like cheating. It's nothing special on easy or normal, but on hard and heroic, and especially extra new game, where enemies are much less likely to be knocked back or down, it's fantastic because enemies that get immobilized by the attack can be launched into the air with a standard rising attack at will. With regards to passive skills like Assault High, Skill Link, and the like, the chaos of battle, as well as the fact that character attack damage is 100% consistent, makes it much more difficult to calculate what kind of impact they have, if any. One thing that should be taken into consideration is this. Skill Link's text is unfortunately pretty vague. It's very well possible that it doesn't matter what kind of skills are used or when. However, one should consult the end results of combat stages before believing that to be certain. Because testing the activation of skills, I discovered that if you use a POW attack of any kind, and then use a Psypher skill, be it POW or Psypher Point, immediately after, the second attack will not count towards your score at the end of the fight. Whereas if you use a Psypher Point skill, then any other skill immediately afterwards, then it will count. However, if you use 3 POW skills immediately after one another, then the first and third attacks will count, but not the second one. And before you ponder, yes, I tested this on easy and hard mode and there was no difference. This could very well mean that the utilization of multiple POW attacks in rapid succession won't actually contribute to the skill link damage boost effectively. However, you should know that while this only applies in instances when the Psypher skills were used immediately after a POW attack was executed, when testing the use of Psypher skills while still in the same chain, but waiting a second or two, the attacks were still counted. And even using a couple of regular attacks in between POW skills was enough to have the Psypher skill activated afterwards to still be counted at the end. Skill activations only add 5 points each time they're counted, but that's not the point. The point is that given that the attacks don't even register at the end of the fight, it's reasonable to assume that Skill Link may not count skills used immediately after POW skills. So be mindful of that fact if you think about spamming skills incessantly. Hopefully that covers everything you'll need to know about Odin Sphere's combat. If not, maybe there was something in the tips and tricks video or resources video. Check out those and others to learn more about this game. It's also capable of reaching the weak spot.
You're gonna do a superhero landing. Wait for it. Woo! Superhero landing. Yeah, that's really hard on your knees. Totally impractical. They all do it.
Mr. Snowman, sing me a song, ba 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 ba.
Now there's a genocide, the monster inside, the voices in your head, they're telling you to wash away the crimson